In 19th and early 20th century Canadian politics, the term reciprocity was used to describe the concept of free trade with the United States. Reciprocity and free trade had been emotional issues in Canadian history as they pitted two conflicting impulses, the desire for beneficial economic ties with the United States against the fear that closer economic ties would lead to American domination. After Confederation, reciprocity was initially promoted as an alternative to Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's national policy. Reciprocity meant that there would be no protective tariffs on all natural resources being imported and exported between Canada and the United States. This would allow prairie grain farmers access to the larger American market and allow them to make more money on their exports. In the 1890s, it also meant that the Western Canadian farmers could obtain access to cheaper American farm machinery and manufactured goods, which otherwise had to be obtained at higher prices from central Canada. In the 1891 election, the Liberal Party of Canada ran on a reciprocity platform. It lost to Macdonald, who won with his nationalist slogan, "The old flag, the old policy, the old leader." The Liberals temporarily shelved the concept. When reciprocity came up again in 1896, it was the Americans who proposed it to Wilfrid Laurier's Liberals. The ideas excited them, and they immediately began to campaign for it. The Conservatives feared that they would lose the election again, and due to the valuable agreement, and despite their general belief that it would do Canada good, they began to campaign against it. The Liberal Party went on to win the 1896 election, and some years later it negotiated an elaborate reciprocity agreement with the United States in 1911. Finally, in 1910 to 1911, its achievement appeared to be at hand. In the spring of 1911, the American Congress, which had long rejected reciprocity, approved the idea. During a cross-country tour in 1910, Laurier found strong support for the idea of free trade among the farmers of Ontario and the West. Many Canadians, however, opposed the bill because they feared it would hurt Canada's protected industries. Some even feared reciprocity would lead to annexation of the United States. Statements made by prominent Americans heightened this fear. Reciprocity became a major issue in the federal election of 1911. Laurier's Liberals were trashed in the election. Robert Borden's Conservatives won 134 seats and the Liberals 87 seats. The Laurier era was over. Robert Borden and his Conservatives party now faced the challenges of guiding Canada through the difficulties that lay ahead. Canada and the United States cooperated closely in World War II as both nations saw new levels of prosperity and a determination to defeat the Axis powers. Prime Minister William Mackenzie King and President Franklin Roosevelt were determined not to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. They met in August 1940, issuing a declaration calling for close cooperation, and formed the Permanent Joint Board on Defense. King sought to raise Canada's international visibility by hosting the August 1943 Quadrant Conference in Quebec on military and political strategy. He was a gracious host but was kept out of the important meetings by Winston Churchill and Roosevelt. Canada allowed the construction of the Alaska Highway and participated in the building of the atomic bomb. 49,000 Americans joined the RCAF Air Force through the Clayton Knight Committee, which had Roosevelt's permission to recruit in the United States in 1940 to 1943. American attempts in the mid-1930s to integrate British Columbia into a united West Coast military command had aroused Canadian opposition. Fearing a Japanese invasion of Canada's vulnerable coast, American officials urged the creation of a united military command for an Eastern Pacific Ocean theater of war. Canadian leaders feared American imperialism and the loss of autonomy more than they did Japanese invasions. In 1941, Canadians successfully argued within the PGBD for mutual cooperation rather than unified command for the West Coast. During the 20th century, relations between Canada and the United States had been growing closer, especially in regards to economy. Cooperation in defense had increased during the Second World War and the Cold War. Their relations became strained in the 1960s. President Kennedy and Prime Minister Diefenbaker disliked each other. Diefenbaker had been reluctant to accept nuclear warheads from NATO's bomb-arc missiles that guarded Canada. He also hesitated to back the United States during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Prime Minister Pearson angered the Americans when he questioned American policy in Vietnam and refused to stop American draft dodgers from entering Canada. In 1965, Pearson publicly proposed a halt to the American bombing of North Vietnam. When he visited American President Lyndon Johnson afterwards, the president grabbed the prime minister by the lapels of his suit, condemned his interference. There was also conflict between the two nations over international boundaries. In 1969, an American tanker, the USS Manhattan, went through the Northwest Passage in order to establish a route to transport Alaskan oil to the East Coast. Canada protested that the Americans had gone through Canadian waters without permission, while the Americans claimed the passage was international.
He got along all right with Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was the president at the beginning of Diefenbaker years, but things really came a cropper when John F. Kennedy was elected the president. He was young, he was charming, he had charisma, and Diefenbaker had none of those characteristics, and so by comparison, he looked dowdy and old and not very interesting, and Diefenbaker felt that. And so that added to the tension in the relationship.
Kennedy couldn't even pronounce his name right. He called him Diefenbaker. Kennedy sort of insulted his fishing abilities, of which Dief was most proud, and so there's all these strains in the personal relationship, which then carried over to the multilateral relationship in terms of great conflicts ensued over whether Canada should have nuclear warheads on its soil. Diefenbaker opposed this. There was a great conflict over the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which Diefenbaker said, "You didn't keep us informed about what was going on here," and Diefenbaker was slow too slow, as Kennedy thought, to respond in terms of support on that crisis, and so it created one of the most searing divisions at the top in bilateral history.
Diefenbaker was of the view that Canada should trade less with the United States, should be less dependent on the United States for its security, and so these kinds of tensions built up to a high point, or a low point really, with the Beaumark missile crisis at the end of Diefenbaker years. Diefenbaker made a commitment that instead of the interceptor fighters that they had originally agreed to buy, that they would instead arm Canada with Beaumark missiles, and the Beaumark missiles arrived, but he wouldn't allow the nuclear warheads to go on, and so that became a big election issue in 1963. The U.S. administration actually intervened in that election, and Diefenbaker lost. Never forgave the Americans for it.
In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Canadians were worried about American control of their economy. A federal government policy paper in 1970 talked about three options for Canada's economy: the status quo, even closer integration with the United States economy, or a third option, which was to strengthen the Canadian economy in order to reduce the influence of the American economy. Trudeau tried to follow the third option by developing special trade links with the European Common Market and Japan. These attempts failed as the other parties were uninterested. Perhaps they feared American resentment towards any special privileges granted to Canada. Trudeau then began to take action to limit the American influence on the Canadian economy. The federal government insisted that Canadian banks must be 75% Canadian-owned and radio and television stations 80% Canadian-owned. Provinces too began to limit American investment. For example, Prince Edward Island put restrictions on foreign American ownership of land. In 1973, Trudeau established the Foreign Investment Review Agency, FIRA. This agency had to approve the establishment of any new foreign companies in Canada, and the takeover of Canadian companies by foreign companies. FIRA examined each proposal by taking into account the effect on employment, the impact on productivity and technological development, the effect on product variety, the effect on competition, the number of Canadians who would hold managerial positions in the company, the match between the investment and Canadian economic priorities. Although FIRA was aimed at all foreign businesses and takeovers, it mostly targeted American investment. In 1900, there were Canadians who remembered American invasion of Canada during the War of 1812. Those who read the newspapers at the turn of the last century knew that the United States was building an empire in places such as the Philippines, Cuba, and Panama. American imperialists were talking about ruling the whole Western Hemisphere. Some Canadians feared that the United States would take over Canada. In 2000, there were Canadians who fought alongside American soldiers in the Second World War in Korea, or served with American comrades in NORAD and NATO. Canadians today read their newspapers to follow American sport teams. They spend hours every day listening to American music and enjoying American television or movies. The two countries are allies and share a mass culture based on print and electronic media. Much of that culture is dominated by the United States, though. The Canadian-American border is the longest undefended border in the world, frequently crossed for entertainment and tourism, and increasingly for business. The United States is Canada's biggest trading partner by far. Most foreign investment in Canada is American, and many Canadian companies are American-owned. In the late 19th century and again in 1911, Canadians rejected reciprocity partly for fear of being annexed by the United States. Today, Canada is a partner in NAFTA. Some economists are talking about a common North American currency. Questions about Canada's future in the face of American culture and economic influence concern all Canadians in the